President, thank you very much. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to make some comments in relation to the Future Made in Australia legislation. And in doing so, I wanted to reflect on where the country has been over these last few decades and pay credit to the Labor Party in the 1980s for helping the country bring down the tariff wall, remove subsidisation of industry. Sometimes these measures were supported by the Liberal Party. Not all the deregulation and other economy measures which were required to build a robust modern economy were supported. But in general terms, I think in the long run of history we will look back at that period as a period where tough judgments were made by that government, the Hawke government, and I think most reasonable people would say that that was a government that did things that others could have done but didn't do when they were given the opportunity. And these measures in relation to the Future Made in Australia are winding back the clock 40 years maybe more, to a period where the government thought that it knew better than the market, that it could swim against the tide of global capital, that people in Canberra were so smart and so intelligent that they would just run the show from here. And it is a very scary position for the country to be in, but it is perhaps not surprising. And this has been a regressive parliament, I have been shocked that I've been part of a parliament that wound back a tax reform of the last parliament. In this parliament, the government reimposed a tax bracket that had been removed by the last parliament. And now we have a government that is seeking to establish a picking winners approach here in Canberra, where big businesses, foreign domestic businesses will be funded by the Commonwealth Government. Now that is an approach which was discredited. And you can go back to the 1970s and look at the modest members and all the different debates that were had by Bert Kelly and others. And these issues were ventilated for decades before the Hawke government finally put the tariff wall and subsidisation to death, to their eternal credit. And now we are back in about 1975 or something. We've got another treasurer, another doctor treasurer like Jim Cairns, who thinks he can establish the show here in Canberra and fund the economy as a venture capitalist now. And it's been a very regressive period. So I would say that the central charge against this government is that it has been so focused on what is important to its favourite fellow travellers, the unions, the super funds and co, that it has had no time to resolve the major economic challenges of the day, which is why people under 40 are going crazy about housing, that the Australian dream is further and further away the longer that the Labor government is in office, why the inflation problem is getting worse here compared to almost any other jurisdiction which we would care to compare ourselves with. And that is the problem, that the government has been so focused on the rent seekers and the bloodsuckers that it has had no time to resolve the major challenges of the day. And this is a continuation of this problem, that the government is trying to feather the nests of its favourite people. Now, we did an inquiry into this bill through the Economics Legislation Committee, and one of the major issues that came up in the inquiry was that the provisions of the bill provide for a form of compulsory unionisation, where there are these grants or payments made by these funds. And in fact, when asked about the so-called community benefit principles, the AMWU said that firms receiving finance, grants or equity investment in their firm should be required to have an enterprise agreement with the relevant trade unions registered or enter the relevant multi-employer bargaining stream. So this whole business is all about our old mate here, of how can we help the people that are closest to us. Not how can we solve problems for the Australian people, how can we solve inflation, how can we help small business, how can we deal with housing. No, how can we give money to our best friends? How can we help the unions? And this is, unfortunately, I mean, if I was advising this government, I would not have come into this parliament when it started back in the middle of 2022 and abolished the Building and Construction Commission. I don't think that was a very good decision. I know that Senator Watt now is having to deal with that mess, and we all wish him well. But I'm not sure it was a great judgment call for the government. And sure, the longer the governments go, they incur integrity issues perhaps when they have made bad judgments. But this is another bad judgment of trying to entrench their favourite people into this new scheme. Now, the Minerals Council of Australia said that the workplace relations elements of the community benefit principles in paragraph 10.3a1 of the bill are unnecessary and will be economically damaging. And the Minerals Council go on to say they are not about improving working conditions, but are a government-mandated attempt at union control of both policy judgments and workplaces. So that's what the Minerals Council are saying. And then we get on to the other issue here, which is that this will entrench permanent rent-seeking through the picking of winners. So the Productivity Commission itself said that industry policies such as the Future Made in Australia can be costly for governments, act as a form of trade protection and distort the allocation of Australia's scarce resources towards activities that Australia is not best placed to undertake. This takes me back to my central charge that we're going back in time some 40 or 50 years here with this approach. Now, the chair of the Productivity Commission, Danielle Wood, has described the policy as risking forever subsidies. And she says that we risk creating a class of businesses that is reliant on government subsidies, and that can be a very effective way of getting them to come back for more. So the Productivity Commission is saying what it's always said, that this idea of subsidising industry is very dangerous for the economy. And I guess they must regret that we are now back in the 1970s and having the same debates that were won then after such a lengthy debate. The former chair of the Productivity Commission, Gary Banks, has said that the Future Made in Australia is a fool's errand which risks making mistakes of the past by propping up so-called political favourites. Now, he was described as a flat earther by the Prime Minister. So apparently now, if you're an economist setting out that there are orthodox things here that have been determined over many decades, such as there is a risk of government subsidising industry forever, you're now a flat earther. So, I mean, I wonder whether there is a point where the government thinks, well, maybe we actually should try and focus on what's going to be good for the people of Australia, rather than just people who are close to us. And that is really the major issue here with Future Made in Australia, that it's all about entrenching union control over workplaces, as set out in these community benefit principles. And during the hearings, we had the ACTU come to the hearings, and I was able to ask Ms O'Neill, the chair of the ACTU, about these community benefit principles. And she gave, I would have to say, an answer which was very unclear. We then asked the AMWU and AWU what their view were, and they gave a very clear answer saying, no, they thought it was very important that any organisation that wanted to receive these funds or grants or subsidies should have a mandatory unionisation policy. So at least they were honest. And I went on to congratulate the AWU for being honest, because at least they were saying what this is all about. It's all about entrenching control amongst a small group of people. And that is before you even consider the idea of crony capitalism. I mean, I would say this is about crony unionisation. So the Industry Minister, Ed Husic, thinks that he's going to be a venture capitalist. He's going to go around and he's going to invest in a whole lot of different businesses in Australia and obviously abroad. We've seen the billion-dollar bet he's made on PsiQuantum, which is not an Australian company. He's going to do that. Now, in the process of doing so, he's going to commit our taxpayer funds in circumstances where there must be a union involved. So this is going to be another opportunity to enrich their favourite vested interests. But ultimately, all the chickens will come home to roost, because the Australian people will be wising up to this after 2.5 long years of Labor, that their economic circumstances are much poorer than they were back in May 2022. And regrettably, I've got to say that on issues like housing for under 40s, these issues are going to get worse before they get better if this government is to stay in office. And so I think people generally want their governments to do well, but they will be very sceptical of efforts to give special deals and handouts to a select few union czars, which is what we've seen under this government. And it was only just last week that we discovered that the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, had decided that he would use his position to file a false public interest immunity claim here in the Senate, when the Senate had sought an order for production of documents to get access to files that were provided by one of his favourite vested interests, the CBUS Super Fund, which is chaired by his former boss, Mr Wayne Swan, who's also the president of the Labor Party. The story gets better and better, doesn't it? And Mr Chalmers, Dr Chalmers, I should say, he used his position to file a false public interest immunity claim to stop the Senate getting access to the document. Now, we are lucky that as citizens we have access to freedom of information laws, because under the FOI laws you can appeal a judgment, and we were able to appeal to the Information Commissioner, which provided us the document that Chalmers had sought to cover up. And the document was an effort to lobby by the CBUS Super Fund to get a special deal so it could cover up its stamp duty costs to members. It wanted to conceal transparent information from members. Now, why would the Treasurer use his position to conceal this information from the Australian people? The answer is because it is a government for vested interests, and they were embarrassed about this idea of being exposed. But what it shows is it is completely on brand that when you get out of bed and you think about what are the 10 things I can do for my best friends today, and use my public office to help my best friends, not help the Australian people. The consequence of all these funds that Labor have set up will be bad for the Australian people, because the Reconstruction Fund, the Housing Fund, all the other funds they've set up, the off-balance sheet items will all be disastrous legacies for the Australian people. But they will also have a very dangerous legacy for the government in the short term, because ultimately, when you stack up these funds and put all your mates onto their boards and they end up doing dodgy things, they just become integrity issues. So it is a very good lesson of what not to do for future governments. You would not come into government and spend all your time and capital establishing these off-balance sheet items, which then go away and make these judgments, put your mates onto the boards. It's very dangerous, because it will only highlight more and more integrity issues like the one we've been discussing this morning to do with Mr Swan and Mr Chalmers. So ultimately, the Parliament may enact a form of this future made in Australia. If it does, it will entrench a funding source which will be available for rent seekers. And as the committee process showed, everyone wanted to get access to these monies. The chocolate makers, the dog companies, the caravan companies, the desk companies, the lampshade companies, the flag makers, the camera makers. Everyone that had a business in Australia had applied to this committee to get access to these funds. And, you know, to be honest with you, I understand this, but that highlights how dangerous this idea is, that it will open the door to the rent seekers. You won't be able to drive from Sydney to Canberra anymore because it'll be so log-jammed with people trying to come from Sydney, and the Barton Highway, I imagine, will also be clogged up with people coming from Melbourne to put their hand out to get some taxpayer funds. And I guess they are acting rationally, but this is a very dangerous idea that people in Canberra will dish out funds to their mates. But I again caution the government that these ideas may be attractive to them as a way to pay off and to help them with their favourite vested interests. But I believe that they only expose the government to more integrity risks, because ultimately the funds will be spent spent poorly or badly, or there'll be cover-ups.